The magic of stories, David's journey to learn English. Learning English can sometimes feel like a big challenge, especially if you're just starting out or feel stuck. But the good news is that there are simple and fun ways to improve your skills. One of the best ways to learn is through stories. Stories help you understand new words, improve your grammar, and teach you how to use the language in real situations. Whether you are a beginner or more advanced learner, reading stories allows you to enjoy the process while learning naturally. In this story, you'll see how a young boy named David uses reading simple stories to improve his English. Like David, you can take your learning step by step, starting with easy words and sentences and gradually getting better. So, let's dive into David's journey and see how story can make learning English fun and effective. David was a young boy who lived in a small town surrounded by fields of green and hills covered in wildflowers. Although David loved learning new things, there was one subject that made him feel anxious and frustrated: English. He had always been curious about the language, but for some reason, it seemed like a mystery that he could never solve. In school, when his English teacher, Mrs. Williams, spoke in English, David often felt lost. The words seemed to bounce around in his mind, but they didn't form any meaning. He could understand some basic words, but when it came to speaking or writing, David was always confused. He tried memorizing words and rules, but it was never enough. When he looked at a sentence in English, it felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. His classmates seemed to understand everything without effort, and David couldn't understand why English felt so difficult for him. Every time he made a mistake, he felt embarrassed, like he was the only one struggling. One afternoon, after another frustrating English class, David sat under a big tree outside his school. His friends were chatting excitedly in English, while David sat silently, wishing he could join in. That's when he overheard a conversation between two older students walking past him. One of them was telling the other, "English is easy when you learn it step by step. You just need to start with the basics and let it grow naturally." The words caught David's attention. Step by step? He thought. Is there a way to make learning English easier? He had never thought of it that way before. David wondered if there was a simpler way to understand the language. That evening, as he sat at the dinner table, David told his parents about what he had heard. "Mom, Dad, I overheard someone say that English is easier when you learn it step by step. Can that really be true?" His mother, a kind woman with a warm smile, looked at David thoughtfully. "It's true, David. Learning English doesn't have to be rushed. It's like climbing a staircase. You can't jump to the top in one step. You need to take it one step at a time. And one of the best ways to learn English is by reading stories." "Stories?" David asked, his curiosity growing. "How can stories help me?" His father, who was a teacher, explained, "Stories are powerful tools for learning. When you read stories, you learn new words, understand grammar, and see how sentences are put together. You start to think in English naturally, without worrying about memorizing rules. It's the most enjoyable way to learn a language." David was intrigued. "That sounds like something I could try. But where do I start?" His mother smiled. "Let's go to the library tomorrow. We can pick out some books with simple stories, and you can start reading them. The most important thing is to enjoy it. Don't stress over every little detail. Just let the stories teach you." The next morning, David and his parents went to the library. The library, though small, was a treasure trove of books. They walked past shelves filled with books of all kinds. David's mother led him to a section filled with books for beginners. There, he found a collection of short stories that seemed perfect for someone just starting to learn English. The first book he picked up was titled The Adventures of Timmy and His Dog. It was a short collection of simple stories about a young boy named Timmy and his loyal dog, Max. The sentences were short and clear, and there were colorful pictures that helped explain the story. David felt hopeful. If he could understand these stories, maybe he could learn to speak English fluently, just like his classmates. He sat down in a quiet corner of the library, his heart beating with anticipation. Opening the first page, he began to read slowly, sounding out each word. At first, he stumbled over a few words, but he didn't let that stop him. He used the pictures to help him understand the story. Timmy and Max went on a little adventure, and David smiled as he imagined himself in Timmy's shoes. After finishing the first story, David looked up and felt a sense of pride. He hadn't understood everything perfectly, but he had understood enough to get the main idea. The most important thing was that he had finished a story in English, and it didn't feel as hard as he had thought it would. He told his parents that evening, "I read my first story in English today. I didn't understand all the words, but I got the story. It feels great." David's parents were happy to see his excitement. His mother said, "That's wonderful, David. You're already on your way. Keep reading and don't worry if you don't understand every word. The more you read, the easier it will get." David continued reading every day. The more stories he read, the more his vocabulary grew. However, he still faced challenges. Some words were unfamiliar, and sometimes he didn't quite understand the meaning of certain sentences. But David remembered what his mother had said, "Take it one step at a time." One afternoon, as he was reading a story about a boy who helped a stranded bird, David came across a sentence that confused him. The boy was resolute in his determination to help the injured bird, despite the rain pouring down in sheets. David read the sentence twice, then stopped. He didn't know what resolute or determination meant. He sighed and put the book down. He felt frustrated. "I'll never get this," he thought. But then he remembered something. His mother had told him that learning English was like climbing a staircase. He didn't have to understand everything all at once. David took a deep breath and decided to look up the words in a dictionary. He learned that resolute meant being firm in one's decision, and determination meant having a strong will to do something. David smiled. He understood the sentence now, and he felt proud of himself for not giving up. Slowly but surely, he was making progress. The more he read, the easier it became to figure out unfamiliar words by looking at the context. As weeks went by, David noticed a significant change. Not only was he improving in reading and understanding English, but he also began to feel more confident. The fear he once had of speaking in English started to fade. David felt more comfortable trying to use the new words he had learned. One day, while walking home from school, David was practicing some of the English sentences he had read earlier. He was so absorbed in practicing that he didn't even realize he had been speaking to himself out loud. He said, "I want to help others, just like the boy in the story helped the bird. I can do it too." A woman walking by heard David speaking in English and smiled. "You speak English very well," she said. David looked up, surprised. "Really?" he asked, feeling a mix of pride and disbelief. "Absolutely," the woman replied. "It sounds like you've been practicing a lot." David couldn't believe it. He had spoken in English without hesitation. The nerves that used to freeze him in place were gone. He had learned to speak English naturally by reading stories, and now, he was beginning to think in English too. One evening, as David was reading a story about a girl who dreamed of traveling the world, something amazing happened. He was reading the story when suddenly, without realizing it, he found himself thinking in English. For the first time, David didn't have to translate the words from his native language into English. The words just flowed into his mind. He smiled and thought, "I can do this. I can speak and think in English." David began using English more in his daily life. He practiced with his friends, speaking to them in English and telling them the stories he had read. Slowly, they began to notice a difference. David wasn't the shy, nervous boy he once was. He was becoming fluent, one story at a time. Months passed, and David continued his journey with English. He read more challenging stories, from fairy tales to adventure books, expanding his vocabulary and improving his grammar. His confidence soared, and he no longer hesitated to speak in English. One day, during English class, Mrs. Williams asked the class to read a passage aloud. When it was David's turn, he stood up confidently and read the passage with ease. His classmates listened in awe. They had never heard David speak English so fluently before. Mrs. Williams smiled proudly and said, "David, your improvement is remarkable. You've come so far." David felt a wave of happiness. He had worked hard, and it had paid off. He had learned English not by memorizing rules or stressing over mistakes but by reading stories and letting them guide him. The magic of stories had made all the difference. As he left school that day, David couldn't help but smile. He had climbed his staircase, step by step, and now, he could see the view from the top. He had learned to speak English confidently, and he knew that his journey was just beginning. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed David's journey and learned something valuable about how stories can help you improve your English. Remember, just like David, you can take your learning one step at a time. Whether you're reading simple stories or challenging ones, every step you take brings you closer to fluency. Keep practicing, stay curious, and most importantly, have fun with your learning. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tips and stories to help you on your English learning adventure. See you in the next video.